Anne Spincer was born in a Virginia farm in 1882. Spincer's mother enrolled her in school for the first time when she was 11 at the Virginia Theological Seminary and College. She helped to establish the Lynchburg chapter of the NAACP. Spincer wrote poetry about religion and race. 30 of her poems were published during her lifetime. She was the first African American woman poet to be featured in the Norton Anthology of Modern Poetry, 1973. She is also the subject of Half My World, The Garden of Anne Spincer, a history and guide, 2003, by Rebecca T. Frischkorn and Reuben M. Rainey, and Lessons Learned from a Poet's Garden, 2011, by Jane Barber White. Anne Spincer began writing poetry when she was a student at the Virginia Seminary, where she wrote her first poem, The Skeptic, Now Lost. She continued to write poetry throughout her life. Spincer's poems spoke to race. Spincer's career as a poet began in 1919, when she was planning to open a chapter of the NAACP in Lynchburg. Anne Spincer hosted James Weldon Johnson in her home as a traveling representative for the NAACP. It was during this visit in 1919 that Johnson discovered Anne's poetry. She was 40 years old at the time her first poem was published. Most of Spincer's work was published during the 1920s. During the Harlem Renaissance, her work was highly respected during her time. Her work was featured, which connected her to the lifetime of the Harlem Renaissance, even though she lived in Virginia. Spincer was able to publish over 30 poems. After her death in 1975, much of her work was published in Time's Unfading Garden, Anne Spincer's Life in Poetry. She was later featured in Shadowed Dreams, Women's Poetry of the Harlem Renaissance. In the later half of the 20th century, much of Spincer's lost work was found and published by other famous poets. Spincer lived through segregation, but she found an escape in her garden and in the cottage, which her husband Edward built for her in the garden behind their home. Here, she could lose herself in the flowers and creativity and work into the wee hours of the morning. Spincer spent a lot of time in her garden. In the cottage accomplishment, her literary success. The Spincer home on Pierce Street became a salon for many intellectuals who visited regularly, and for African American travelers who found hospitality at the Spincer home when laws of segregation barred them from hotels. Spincer died of cancer when she was 93 and is buried in Lynchburg, Virginia. A selection of her papers is archived in the Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library of the University of Virginia.